I'd like to talk a little bit about my Texas days. I lived in Texas from the fall of 1978 for 3 years. Yeah, and I moved to Boston in the fall of 1981. Great times. Played many great gigs. Had a lot of great music at that time. Wonderful musicians. It's really fun. Let me back up a little bit and start in Seattle. That's where I moved from to go to Texas. So I made good friends and played many gigs with a wonderful pianist in Seattle named Butch Nordahl. And Butch Nordahl had gone to school at North Texas State University back in the early 70s. Actually, late 60s, I think it was. Yeah, I think he said it was 69, something like that. But one day Butch said, "Hey, what are you going to do down the road?" I said, "I don't know. I have no idea." He said, "Why don't you go to North Texas State University?" I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, there's a great program there led by a wonderful director named Leon Breeden. It'd be a chance for you to get some wonderful experience, traveling a bunch, playing with a bunch of great musicians, and it's a good sort of pickup ground, a training area for people who move on to a lot of very successful gigs on the road." And I said, "Really?" I said, "Where's it at?" He said, "North Texas State University is in Denton, Texas." And I said, "Okay, let me think about it." So I looked on the map, talked to my wife about it, and I said, "Why not?" Called up down there, asked when the auditions were. This was, I think he told me that like maybe early summer. So, 6, 8, 10 weeks later, we took off to North Texas. A couple of funny little incidents surrounding that. I had never driven across country. I'd only lived in Oregon and in Seattle, and my wife the same. So we rented a U-Haul truck, and interestingly enough, we drove our little 65 green Datsun car sedan into the back of the truck. We actually took off the doors from downstairs storage area and used those as the little rudders, like little ramps, to drive our little small Datsun in the back of this great big U-Haul. Stuffed it full of everything we had, which wasn't a lot. Got a big tow hitch thing, and put our 69 red and white Volkswagen van on the back. We called it the good guy van. And headed off to Texas. Never been there before, but it was fun. And fortunately, it was uneventful. Probably the most uneventful things on that drive is we stopped at Yellowstone National Park, and I caught some beautiful trout. So we get to Texas, and it was hot, big time. As I mentioned, we'd never lived any place other than the Northwest. So, my goodness, pulling into town and it's 103 degrees the first day, it was difficult. We searched around, scoured the newspapers and looked at a couple of places, and we rented a little house. And back in those days, what was on Fannin Street, I think? No, it wasn't Fannin, something like that. Might have been Fannin Street. Anyway, in those days, we paid $200 for a 2-bedroom house, yard, driveway, everything. It was a good living in those days. And there we were. We had, again, with the heat, we had one air conditioner. It was a window air conditioner. It was an old funky little house, but we liked it. And so we had our little mattress that we had brought with us laid down in the living room in front of that air conditioner, sucking up that cool air because we were hot. I think I'd experienced, 2 days in my lifetime of 100-degree weather before I moved to Texas. And that summer was a warm one down there. There were over 45 days in a row over 100 degrees. By the second and third day, we were hanging out in shopping malls and going to movies that we'd already seen just to get into air conditioning. It was hot. Interesting enough, 2 years later, actually about a year later, you get used to this stuff. We were out playing softball 103. But that first summer was challenging with the heat. I actually felt a little bit sick a whole bunch of the time in my stomach. I think it was a little bit of, I know it was a little bit of, heat exhaustion, overheating. I'm the kind of person that I real quickly when I get overheated, my actually body temperature rises a little bit, and I had a little bit of a headache and sweating the whole summer. That first summer going into the fall of '78 there. I went up to the school, North Texas State, found where the auditions were going to be held, a little sign-up sheet, and signed my name on the board. So here I was at North Texas State University, going to audition for the famous 1 O'Clock Lab Band. And I had no idea what to expect, none at all. Butch Nordahl just said, "Don't worry about it, you'll do great." So I trusted him. I had no idea what to expect, but I was very excited. The very first night, we drove around the little bitty town, Denton, Texas, and saw 2 or 3 clubs that had tons of people packed in, and we went in and they were playing jazz. In those days, the little town of Denton had about, I would say 6 places that had live music pretty much every single night, and 3 of those specifically were playing jazz. I was elated. I'd come from Seattle. There was plenty of jazz there, but this was so localized, so central, almost like a little, just a little plaza area with jazz clubs on each side of this little square. Excuse me. And I went into this one called Benny's, and my goodness, they were grooving like crazy. And then I went to these other 2 and tried them out, and everything was cool. So the very second night, I went back to Benny's again, and they were playing, and I thought, these guys are good players. So I went up and introduced myself and started talking to them, and I found out they were guys who went to school at North Texas. They were living there too, to get the experience of playing in the 1 o'clock lab band. And the tenor player's name was Bob Belden, outstanding musician. And I said, hey, can I sit in? I'm new in town. And he looked at me, kind of funny, but kind of with a heavy attitude and said, well, I don't know, can you? And I said, well, I'm sure I can fit in. He said, okay, man, let me check with the bass player. And he said to the bass player, hey, this guy's going to sit in. And I introduced myself to the bass player. Hi, I'm Jim. And he said, hi, I'm Lou. That was Lou Harlos. I didn't know him at the time, obviously. Lou's a icon in the Texas jazz scene these days, has been for the last 40 years. And I sat on his bass, and Belden, being the sort of, hard ass that he was, which is pretty typical of a lot of jazz players, but he said, man, Cherokee, you got Cherokee? And I said, of course. He goes, here. And he going, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Tempo must have been like 280-ish probably. And I did know Cherokee, and I'd been playing pretty serious for a number of years leading up to that. So we played it, and I had no problem at all. Afterwards, Belden's like, yeah, man, that's the ticket. The drummer was Bruce Hall, wonderful player. And there was a piano player, but I don't remember his name. It wasn't a couple of guys that I played with a lot, over the next few years, but there was a piano player there. And I played Cherokee, and he said, man, how about one more? And I said, sure. And I think we just played a blues and F after that. And I walked and took the solo, and they were very positive and very excited. He said, man, come back anytime. So I did come back every night for about the next 3 or 4 nights, and there were different jazz players playing there. But often Belden and a few of his friends would all show up, to sit in and play too. Well, I was in town about 3 or 4 days, and one of the guys I think I'd met at Benny said, oh man, there's great jazz in Dallas. You got to go to this one club, and I forget the name of it, but it had a number. It was 1659 Club, something like that, whatever. And we got in our little red and white 69 Volkswagen van, no air conditioning. By the way, one of the amazing things about Texas, which I had never experienced, even though I'd had experienced a few days of heat in my life, and that was in Texas, it didn't get cool at night. It dropped about 10 degrees. Those 102-degree days, it'd be 92 at midnight. And man, that was strange. That was hard to get used to. So we're driving off to Dallas, about an hour away in our little van, and it's hot. You roll the window down, and you're hit with 95-degree weather, and I was like, ooh, that didn't feel good. So you drove around sweating like crazy in a little van with no AC and 95, 98 degrees outside in the nighttime. So we drove to Dallas, and my wife said, how we get, should we get a newspaper or something? I said, no, I can find this place. And lo and behold, after stumbling around a bunch of different streets, it only took about 30 minutes, I actually looked over and said, hey, there's the club right there. So we drove right to it. Went in, and there was a quartet playing. And at that time, I didn't know any of the players, but it was saxophone, piano, bass, and drums. And they were outstanding players. I later learned they were, some of the best players in the area, guys who had been at North Texas Lab Band a few years before, and they were, quote, heavy guys in Dallas. Well, we watched them play, and after, the first tune or so, the bass player was kind of complaining, man, my hand's sore here. I sort of cut it on, doing some yard work or something today, and they played another tune. So I went up and I said, hey, do you mind if I sit in? I'm new in town. I'm here, from Seattle. I'm going to be auditioning for the 1 o'clock lab band. Can I sit in and play a tune? The bass player said, my hand's killing me, man. Come on over here and play. And he was older than most of the guys. The other guys must have been, 28, 30 years old. And he looked like he was a 40, 50-year-old man. And I said, oh, thank you very much. So I sat in and played on his double bass. He went down and sat at the table, as a matter of fact, in front with my wife and made friends with her, and they started talking. And I played a tune, and he yelled out, man, that's great, play another one. Well, I ended up playing 3 tunes, and then they took a break. And, of course, I went over and introduced myself, and he introduced himself. John Wooster is his name, and, complimented me, and I said, oh, thanks a million, man, it was fun. And I talked to all the guys in the band, just, it's the casual, normal musician BS stuff, and we took off home. Well, I believe that was about a Friday or Saturday night, and the following Monday was the auditions. So my audition times, I think 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, there was, tons of bass players waiting in line. I'm thinking there was something about 40 bass players auditioning that semester, roughly as I can remember. And again, I didn't know one of them, but later on, of course, I made friends with all of them, and many of them are very successful, highly successful, somewhat famous bass players today. And I get ready to go in for my spot, and guys are coming in, guys are going out, and they're like, oh my God, that was tough. Oh, that's incredible. And guys are warming up out in the room, and some of them are playing a million miles an hour, and some of them just standing there scared. And I walked in and looked up, and my goodness, the guy who was auditioning was the same man I had met at that jazz club in Dallas named John Worcester. And he said, oh, hey, man, you're Jim Stinnett. And I said, yeah. He goes, oh, my God, man, I had no idea I'd be seeing you again. I said, I sure didn't know I'd be seeing you. So I sat in, did my audition, and everything was hunky-dory, and I left. And I thought, wow, how cool. I'd already met this guy. I'd played his bass in his club. Well, I ended up winning the spot in the 1 o'clock lab band, and that was very exciting. And then one of the coolest things was, I think that was about a Monday or a Tuesday. And the very next day, Leon Breeden called and said, hi, my name's Leon. I don't know you or you don't know me, but you're going to be in the 1 o'clock lab band starting next week. He said, would you be interested in playing a gig with the band this weekend? And I'm like, well, of course. So Friday and Saturday night of that week, before school started, I worked with the 1 o'clock band. We played down in Dallas. I forget the club again, but it was a fairly big, actually it was the Dallas Playboy Club. That's what it was. And the guest star was Bob Hope. And I had seen him on TV and stuff, but I'd never seen him personally. So we played, and he was hilarious, kind of dirty, based on the environment there, making cracking jokes about the band and everything else. And it was real fun. And then that was the point I really got to know a bunch of the guys in the band. And I met a number of guys for a second time that I had seen earlier that week and the week before playing in the little jazz clubs around town. So that was the beginning of it. It was really exciting. We come to next week, and we have the rehearsal, and I had walked in this building before. It was an old building, big square box. The next year was when we moved into their new facility. Again, that was 40 years ago. But this big square box, and I walked in. I got there real early, and I looked at the setup, and I went, saxes in the front, trombones on a riser, trumpets back on another riser, drum to the left of them, bass back behind and off to the side of the drums, and then piano down there and guitar. And all the music stands there, and the music was on the stands. And I thought, this is not going to make it. I had played enough big band before, everything, but enough big band to go, I am not sitting in the back out on the corner. I can't hear diddly squat, particularly when I'm back behind on the other side of the drums. So I simply moved some stuff around. I moved some risers, got rid of those. I put myself down in front, right beside, just elbow to elbow, to where the jazz tenor player would be sitting. And the piano would be immediately to my right. And I thought, okay, I can hear stuff here. And as I'm doing this, guys are walking in who I don't know. And they're going, just looking at me like, what are you doing, man? What are you doing changing this whole stage area setup? And nobody said a word, though. And drummer came in, and he kind of looked at me and said, hey, man, cool. You're down there, huh? I said, oh, yeah. So we got set up, and I'm standing there, and I guarantee all the guys are going, who is this snotty, arrogant bass player who's moved things around? Leon Breeden walked in front of the band. He said, hi, guys, it's going to be a great year. He looks over at me, and he looks at the risers and stuff, and here I am standing, sitting right beside the jazz tenor player and stood him in the back, and he said, did you do this? Did you rearrange it? And I said, yeah, I need to be able to hear. He just kind of looked at me and said, didn't say anything. We started playing, and the rest is history, so to speak. It started grooving from day one. Bruce Hall was playing the drums. Bob Belden was a jazz tenor player. Mike Steinella was the jazz trumpet player. I think Smitty was playing lead alto. Oh, God, there's tons of other guys. I'm sorry, I can't remember them all. Paul Mariconda was playing piano. Oh, great trombone player, playing jazz trombone. I can't remember him. Lead trumpet player is Tom DeLibro. Dave Rickenberg was playing the second tenor spot. I can't remember all the guys. But anyway, it really grooved like heck from just second one. And at North Texas, the 1 o'clock lab band was so famous in those days that our rehearsals literally were filled with 30, 40 people. Never less than 30, sometimes 50 people. They would just simply come to see the band. And there were always or often people traveling. Sometimes it'd be parents of students. Sometimes it'd be other bands that were traveling. Sometimes it'd be a group of high school students. Point is they would just come there to see all this magic that Leon Breeden had captured. So that very first day, there's 30 people there, and we're rehearsing a song, and we finish it, and everybody claps. And it's like, a little concert, just a rehearsal, huh? Well, afterwards, one of the coolest things that's ever happened in my entire life happened, and by gosh, it did put me at ease. So rehearsal's over. Big bink. I'm packing up my bass, and just as I put it in the case, up walks these two men, older gentlemen. And one guy says, "Hi, Jim. My name's Rich Madison, and this here is Jack Peterson. Jack's the guitar teacher here, and I teach euphonium and brass." And I'm like, "Oh, glad to meet you guys." And Rich said, "Man, you play great. Would you like to get together and play sometime?" And I looked at this guy and I said, "Yeah, I'd love it." I was so touched. And then Jack Peterson said, "Man, can you groove?" He said, "Listening to you play is like slipping into a nice old soft pair of slippers." And I'm like, oh my God. I get goosebumps right now thinking about it. What a compliment. And from these two adult professionals, I didn't know how well they played at all, but I could tell they were, professional musicians. And when he said, "Man, listen to you just like slipping into a nice warm pair of slippers, comfortable slippers." And I thought, wow. Well, very quickly, we did some sessions together with those guys in their offices and stuff, and then we started playing gigs, some professional gigs down in Dallas and around, and other concerts and stuff. I remember playing a number of concerts with Rich, and I think Greg Bissonette was on drums. Yeah, you bet. And a great guitarist at that time, a young guitarist, Clint Strong. Whoo, could he play? And we worked a number of gigs together. Jeff Walters played piano with us a lot when we played with Rich. Just a wonderful time. Of course, Bruce Hall played drums a bunch. I'm trying to think who else. I can't remember, but a bunch of wonderful musicians. As the bass player in the 1 O'Clock band, not only did I get just tremendous experience playing with the 1 O'Clock, but I was sort of flavor of the month. And I ended up getting calls before I ever called in from people all over the Southwest or Mid-South about would I do gigs with them. People I'd never met. "Hey, we've got a gig, next Saturday night at such and such a place in Galveston. Would you mind playing with us?" And I'm like, "Wow, I've never been to Galveston." "Well, don't worry about it. We'll pay for an airplane flight down, and we'll have a double bass for you. You just bring your electric." And I'm like, "Cool." I'd go down there and make good money. I did that kind of stuff dozens and dozens of times. I'd fly up to places in Kansas, fly up to places in Illinois. I'd be playing in Oklahoma. I'd be playing all over Texas. And it was quite fun. And fortunately, I was an accomplished enough musician that everywhere I went, people loved my groove. They liked the fact that I could read music well, and I'd just go in and make it happen. I apologize if it sounds like I'm bragging, but my goodness, was it a heyday for me. I met a number of young bass players at North Texas who became great friends for life. One of the first people I met was Mark Minkler. Mark ended up playing, I believe, he played in the 2 O'Clock band that year. He was from Wichita, Kansas. Mark and I became fast friends immediately. Mark is one of the best reading musicians I have ever seen. I mean, bar none of any instrument, just a great reader. Played good time, good double bass. We became long, fast friends and played together a lot, played duets together a lot, played gigs. We'd go see each other's gigs and sit in and play all the time. We hung out tons. Another young bass player I met was Steve Bailey. Steve, I think, was maybe 17 years old at the time. He was this young hotshot kid. I think he was playing maybe in the 3 or 4 o'clock band that first semester, something like that. And he started following me around like a freaking, like a dog, like on my coattail. I couldn't get rid of him. Actually, the truth was I loved his enthusiasm, his desire, and his ambition. And I told somebody one time, yeah, Steve hung out and, sort of took a lot of lessons learned from me. Really what it was I just had stuff that Steve wanted to know, and he was hungry enough to get after it. Because you know how most musicians are. They're willing to share their information and knowledge and help you and teach you and work with you. Just many people are afraid to ask. Steve wasn't afraid, and we became very, very close friends. Interesting enough, 35, 40 years later, Steve became the bass department chairman at Berklee College for my last 2 or 3 years I worked there. Very pleasant. I'm trying to think of who else I met there. I met Peter Dowdle, excellent bass player. Of course, I mentioned a couple of drummers. Met Joel Fulgham. He's a Houston, Texas, heavy musician. I just can't remember. There's so many guys. I apologize for leaving people's names out. But worked a lot with all these guys. The 1 O'Clock band was so unique and interesting. Most of the guys were basically professional players, sort of like myself. I didn't go there to graduate from school. I went there to play in the 1 O'Clock band. And the requirement was I had to take one class. That was it. So I took private lessons from Ed Rainbow on classical and didn't learn much, but nice guy. And I took like an improv class or something, and I was eligible to play in the 1 O'Clock band. And Leon had a really, really cool financial arrangement with the school. By the way, Leon Breeden is one of the best musicians and best directors, organizers, basically a leader of men that I've ever met in my lifetime. Powerful man, and he built that entire North Texas program for many, many years. But he had some sort of a financial arrangement, and I don't know 100% of the details, but it was something like if the school would provide the bus and pay for the travel for the 1 o'clock band to go out and play gigs, well, Leon would charge money for us to play, and half of that money went to the scholarship fund for the School of Music. So they were eager for him to play gigs, and guess where the other half of that money went? To us musicians in the band. I literally made a living my first couple of years in Texas playing in that 1 o'clock band. I mean, besides a lot of other gigs. But it was, so it was a, quote, semi-professional band, wink, wink. We had lots of gigs. Just absolutely loved it. The guys could read. Everybody could read like crazy. And I would stand up there in front of the band right beside the tenor player, and people go, Jim, how come you're up there in the front like that? I said, so I don't have to read the music. And they're like, what? I said, I can hear the chords in the piano. I can hear all the lines from the saxophone. I can hear the harmonies coming from the trombones. I don't have to stare at the page, man. I like playing by ear. And many years later, I heard of a very famous musician who made a comment somewhat like that when he played a big band gig, and the music was there, and he had laid it down on the floor. And the director said, aren't you going to read the music? And he said, I used to read music. I just play music these days. And really, he played by ear and sounded great. Well, I read the music. Of course I did. But as much as possible, my eyes were not on the page. I was listening to the band, and I was just grooving, having fun. Everybody seemed to like it. Leon did too, so it was cool. We took a little tour to California once with the 1 o'clock band, and that was fun. Some crazy stuff happened on that trip, but also we played some tremendously good music. I met when I was in Texas, I think probably the beginning of my second year. I went there in the fall of 78, so I would say it was probably spring of 79. I met a few people that, really, I won't say changed my life, but were some just tremendous musicians and mentors and great players of mine forever. One was I met a pianist who was actually from Seattle, a couple years younger than me, and he was in North Texas, named Jeff Walters. And Jeff was just a tremendous musician. Wonderful ear, a groove just beautiful groove. Reminds you of Wynton Kelly and Herbie. And Jeff had the ability to leave space. Oh my goodness. Too many compers, piano players or guitar players or anybody who's comping, they think it's their job to play every chord and every measure of every song. Jeff always reminded me of that, even at that young age of his, of Red Garland, who would just simply leave some space out until he needed to play some cool chords and make it sound good. I worked with Jeff a lot, and we both auditioned at the same time and met a man named Paul Guerrero. Paul was teaching at a community college at that time, Lakeland Community College, I believe that's what it's called. And Paul was a drummer, and Paul had a steady, I think it was a 3-night gig, Thursday, Friday, Saturday night, at a place called the Bagatelle Restaurant. That's right, Restaurant and Lounge. And I went out and auditioned I went to Paul's school, the little community college, and auditioned. And Paul and I's time, oh baby, we hit it off immediately. We just grooved like crazy. Paul was an old-time drummer I shouldn't call him old, but he was much older than me, a professional drummer who had toured with a number of the great bands. I know Woody Herman's and a bunch of other people. He did a lot of TV shows. I think it was Lena Horne he played with for a long time, a number of people. But Paul was a bona fide professional. And I did this audition, and Paul and I hooked up immediately. And there was a piano player there also and a singer. And afterwards, Paul said, man, I want you to play with me. And I said, Paul, I would love to play with you, and I will, but we got to get a good piano player. And he sort of looked at me and he said, really? I said, well, what do you think of that guy? He said, well, he's just a kid. He's not that good. I said, I have a player that we need to be playing with. So I simply called on the phone to Jeff and I said, Jeff, you got a gig. So Paul Guerrero, Jeff Walters, and I, as a trio, we played for a couple of years at the Bagatelle, and then we did a number of other gigs touring. We did a few recordings, and it was tremendous. There was a singer named Deborah something, I can't remember her last name, and she was not bad, but she was not at the level of our trio. So the trio gig was happening. As a matter of fact, that's where I met Clint Strong, too. His dad would bring him in. Clint was about 14 years old, and he only knew about 4 tunes, and I'm not joking, same 4 tunes always, but by God, could he imitate Bird and play bebop like crazy on those. So we just kicked the tempo up and go crazy, and it was fun as could be. I met lots of good musicians who came into the Bagatelle to hear us play and would sit in. And Mark Minkler would come down all the time, and we'd sort of tag team. I'd say, Mark, you play the next 3 tunes. And Paul always had fun with that. Mark would walk in, and Paul would say, here he is, ladies and gentlemen, Mark Minkler, straight back from his tour of Australia. How about a hand for Mark? And Mark would get red in the face and laugh, of course, because he just drove from Denton. But it was real fun. Just great gigs. Worked a lot at that time, started working gigs and doing a little bit of touring in some different places with a quintet that Bob Belden had put together. In those days, everybody was still close enough, or it wasn't, too far away from Miles Davis's heyday in the, 60s, that we were all copying those songs. Bob Belden, Jim Powell on trumpet, Jeff on piano, Bruce Hall on drums, and myself on bass. And by God, we had, all of the classic Miles arrangements down, and those guys could play. I mean, those guys could really freaking play. And I was just hanging in there trying to play a great time, and I'd been listening to Ron a bunch, so I had that feel. That live at the Plug Nickel, oh my God, could we kick ass like that. I have to say, it was probably the best jazz group overall that I've ever played in my lifetime. We were happening. It was fun. Well, circumstances happened. I forget what. By the way, my wife was teaching school during that whole time. She was teaching Roanoke, is that what it's called? Roanoke Elementary? I think it was it. It was a little bitty sort of town here, right in the middle of the Golden Triangle. The Golden Triangle was Dallas, Denton, and Fort Worth. And she taught, I believe, 3rd grade and maybe 4th grade there for 2 or 3 years. But anyway, things, like I said, things just happened and changed and whatever. And I decided it was time. I wanted to do something different. I was getting a little tired of the jazz world, not because I didn't have gigs. I had lots of them, and it was fun. But I just felt like there was more for me to learn and do. I went to New York City and lived with a friend of mine, up on, I think, 75th, something like that, up by the park, in a little bitty 5-floor walk-up, 1-room apartment, me struggling my bass up there with the bathroom down the hall. And I went up on the weekends to Connecticut and played a Friday, Saturday night gig with my friend Paul Mariconda. So I made a little bit of money there, go back to New York. And I'd go over to Jersey and take lessons from Rufus. That's right. And after I was there for 3.5 weeks, and maybe 4 weeks, I just decided, I don't know about this. And I got my little Volkswagen van and drove back to Denton, Texas. And after talking with my wife and thinking all about it, I'd left Paul Guerrero's gig. So I'm like, no gig there. I mean, I had plenty of gigs, but, not my steady gig. I'd moved on from that. I decided maybe I'll simply go a different direction and study classical music. Because while I could play jazz well, I did not grow up with that classical background on the double bass, which many of the great jazz players I now admired and made friends with some of them, they had done that, and I had not. So I started looking around and talking to people and, reading the newspaper and the magazine. We didn't really have any internet and stuff in those days. And somebody said, man, one of the greatest teachers in the world in bass players is this guy named Ed Barker in Boston. He just landed the gig with the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and you should study there. So I did. That was the beginning of my trek towards New England. One other thing I wanted to mention, I sort of forgot, but not really, and that was while in Texas, I also got to work with Red Garland. Colin Bailey, a drummer who I had worked with a few times. I forget who introduced me. I think Jack Peterson did. Or yeah, maybe so. Matter of fact, I think it was. Excuse me. Jack Peterson booked me on a gig with Buddy DeFranco. He came into town, the great famous clarinetist, and Colin was on the gig. So I met Colin Bailey, and we worked together 5 or 6 nights a week for 2 weeks on that gig. Well, anyway, Colin invited me and said, hey, would you like to play, again, I forgot the name of the club, down in Dallas, with Red Garland and Marshall Ivory on tenor. And I said, sure, I'd love to. So I went down and met Red Garland and started playing. And, of course, this is one of my idols, the Red Garland. And I'm scared. I mean, I can play, but I'm still sort of scared. And, we get into halfway through the night, and Red gets a little drunk, and he goes, yeah, man, like PC. And I didn't sort of understand, but I thought, did he say PC? What's he talking about? Well, 2 tunes later, he goes, yeah, man, like PC. To get into it, like PC. Sounded like PC. And I got so embarrassed, I thought, he's saying PC like Paul Chambers. I can't play like Paul Chambers. Well, I guess I was doing good enough because I got called back. I worked with him, I think, 3 different times. Anyway, and, I never really became close friends with Red, but I talked to him a bunch, and the fun thing was just simply playing with him. He'd lay out and lay out and lay out and not play, and then all of a sudden, bang, bam, bam, bump, just laying a few chords that were just perfect, and I appreciated his space big time, how he played the rests. Well, I went home from those gigs and I was so frustrated and embarrassed. I went, damn it, I have to learn to play like PC. I'd heard Pearl Chambers on the records, but I'd never really, dug into it. I just sort of thumped along and wished I could play like PC. So that was when I started transcribing the music of Paul Chambers. I eventually published that book as my first book I published. That's 40 years ago, here in a couple of months. And that was 22 pages, no, 22 transcriptions. Yeah, like 56 pages, 22 different solos that I transcribed. I published it, self-publisher. That's a whole other story. And then Jamie Abersol started selling it. And, that was before the internet. So he was my main distribution. Today I sell that and lots of books just online, as well as Abersol. But that was the beginning of another era for me, transcribing PC, and then eventually moving to Boston. One of the unfortunate things was I was so excited after a few months of learning PC and transcribing the stuff and getting a bunch of the solos down that I was hoping to meet and work with Red again, and Red had passed away by that time. I was just hoping to say, Red, check this stuff out. You inspired me, and now I got some PC lines. Let's play. But it did its purpose. Playing with Red inspired me, ignited me to just really get serious about copying the jazz masters at that time, mainly PC. Since then, of course, I published a bunch of other books, but I think I've published 4 books now on Paul Chambers, and you bet they don't get old. They're fun. Let me see if there's anything else I left out about Texas. Probably a ton of stuff. I lived there for 3 years. It doesn't really matter. That might be enough. That's sort of me in my Texas days. Fired up.